As a new college freshman with a reputation as a fragile guy, I never imagined that my life would play out like a slapstick comedy. One minute I'm just another student in the cafeteria, the next I'm knocked unconscious by the elbow of an athlete, straight to the hospital with a concussion. Story begins. It all started at a university's famous third cafeteria, a place known across campus for its cheap, delicious food and for being right next to the athletics complex. Naturally, this meant the cafeteria was filled with jocks, like the one standing in front of me in line. This guy was built like a tank, at least 6'3", with broad shoulders, muscular arms, and a tapered waist. Though I couldn't see his face, the blushing glances from the girls nearby told me everything I needed to know. This guy was the whole package. I was trying to keep up with the line, anxiously glancing through the gaps between his arms, worried that I might miss out on my favorite dish, beef ribs. The cafeteria was packed, bodies squeezed tightly together. Suddenly, it was the big guy's turn to order. His deep voice rumbled as he pointed at his choices, and as he waited for his food, I noticed my shoelace had come undone. In the crowded chaos, I crouched down to tie it. That's when disaster struck. The moment I bent down, the athlete in front of me turned around with his tray, and his elbow crashed directly into my head. Fuck! I swore under my breath, just before my vision blurred, and I hit the floor. The last thing I heard before everything went black was his deep voice, laced with panic, shouting above me, "Damn it! Are you trying to fake an injury or something?" When I came to, I was in the hospital, my head still spinning. The campus forum was already blowing up with rumors. Holy crap, David Daddy must be some kind of martial artist. I was there, he barely touched the guy, and the dude collapsed. I swear it wasn't even that hard. I can vouch for David Daddy. Seriously, he must be a secret master of some ancient art, training incognito. Our macho man David Daddy was totally confused, though. His exact words were, "You trying to fake this, or what?" Maybe that kid's skull didn't develop properly. Isn't there a case like that? Could be worth studying. By the way, am I the only one concerned that David Daddy didn't get to eat his beef ribs? One thing's for sure, that freshman is a legend now. I was fully awake now, sitting up in bed, and there he was, the guy who knocked me out, standing at my bedside, glaring down at me. Tall, muscular, with a buzz cut and sharp features, he looked every bit the part of the hard-headed athlete. My head throbbed as I glanced around the sterile hospital room. Feeling a bit queasy, I timidly asked, "Where am I? Why do I feel like I'm going to throw up?" The corner of his mouth lifted in a sardonic smile, and he leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath on my skin. His voice was icy as he spoke through clenched teeth. "You don't remember?" I glanced at his size, compared it to my own, and decided to play it safe. I nodded meekly. With a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, he explained, "We were in the cafeteria. My elbow hit your head. Now you've got a concussion." "What?" I exclaimed, wide-eyed. "No way. I'm nearly 6 feet tall and pretty solid myself. How could a little bump knock me out?" He stood up straight, looking like a mountain towering over me, and scoffed, "You? Solid?" I wanted to argue, but one glance at his intimidating build made me hold my tongue. I muttered under my breath, "Well, maybe not compared to you." He rolled his eyes and knelt down to pick up my shoes, placing them by my feet with an air of annoyance. "The doctor said it's nothing serious. You just need some rest." I watched as he grabbed my ankle and slid my foot into the shoe, tying the laces as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Hey, what are you doing? I can tie my own shoes." I protested, my voice rising in panic. He shot me a cold glare. "Just putting your shoes on? Or are you afraid I'll break your ankle?" He really was a scary guy. So, I quietly muttered, "I can do it myself." Ignoring me, he yanked my foot forward, forcing it into the shoe before standing up again. He looked down at me with a mocking grin. "The doctor said you shouldn't be moving around too much. And for the record, I don't even do this for my own dad." He headed toward the door, turning back to call, "Let's go, princess." I blushed fiercely. Who the hell calls a guy princess? Does he have no shame? As we made our way back to the dorms, he busied himself on his phone, typing furiously. Moments later, a guy from across the courtyard called out, "Hey, David Daddy. Is that you with Princess? Wait, what? My already concussed brain struggled to process what I'd just heard. David Daddy? And who the hell was Princess? David smirked, nudged the guy aside, and replied, Yeah, man, I'm escorting the princess back. Once we reached the dorm, I stood in the doorway and said, Thanks for walking me back. I can take it from here. But instead of leaving, David squeezed past me and tossed his bag onto a chair. I live here too, you know. I blinked. Wait, this guy was David Maye? The same David from my sports major who had been out training since the first day of school? What a small world. Later that night, I grabbed my clothes and made my way to the shower. Just as I was about to close the door, David barged in, shirtless and wearing nothing but boxers. His well-defined chest, sculpted abs, and, well, let's just say it was unfair how guys like him were built. I clutched my towel nervously. David Maye, what are you doing in here? He glanced at me, grabbing a washcloth as if this was all perfectly normal. His eyes roamed over me before he grinned wickedly. What's the big deal? We're both guys, aren't we? Unless you're actually a girl. With that, he reached out as if to pull the towel from my chest. Panicking, I slapped his hand away, but the sudden movement made my head spin again. David caught me just in time, shaking his head in exasperation. Didn't I tell you to take it easy? Stop being so stubborn. He draped my arm over his shoulder as he adjusted the shower's temperature. I was still reeling when David suddenly tugged at my pants. What are you doing? I stammered. He stood up straight, towering over me again, and mimicked my panic tone. I'm helping you take a shower. I don't need your help. I can do it myself. Nope. You're supposed to be resting. If you don't listen, I'll drag you back to the hospital. With that half-joking, half-serious glint in his eye, he barked, Pants off. I stared at him for a long moment. There was no room for negotiation. Reluctantly, with my face burning, I turned around and slowly pulled off my pants. Just as I finished, I felt a hard slap on my butt. I whipped around, completely shocked. David, this 6'3" hulk of a man, licked his lips and casually commented, Not bad. You've got a nice, smooth ass like a girl's. My eyes widened in horror. I forgot all about my concussion, grabbed my towel, and swung it at him. He laughed, dodging out of the bathroom, while I collapsed against the door, panting with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. As I sat in the dorm afterward, scrolling through the campus forum, David, now fully recovered from his antics, was gleefully chatting with students online under his real name. Forum. David Maye is back. Holy crap, David Daddy. What sect did you train in? Can I join? Wait, is the freshman still alive? David lay on his bed, tapping away on his phone with one leg crossed over the other. I could see his replies. Train my ass. See you guys at training tomorrow, 1 lap less, and I'll knock your teeth out. Then, someone named I Want to Flying asked, I heard that freshman got a concussion from your elbow? Is he made of tofu or something? David replied, Not tofu. More like the princess and the pea. Soon enough, my classmates were all over our group chat, calling me Princess P. I stared at my phone, imagining my entire college career reduced to being known as Princess P. My fists clenched around the phone, and I desperately fantasized about assassinating David Maye. I couldn't even land a punch. As I was silently planning revenge, David suddenly appeared behind me, peeking over my shoulder at my screen. Oh, watching your big brother talk on the forum, huh, Princess P? I turned to retort, but he was standing too close. My nose brushed against his chin, making my eyes water from the sudden impact. I am not Princess P. I huffed. Tears welled up in my eyes as my nose throbbed with pain, and despite my best efforts, a couple of drops spilled over. I glanced up to explain, my voice trembling, but before I could say anything, David Maye took 2 huge steps back, clutching his chest dramatically. His face flushed from his cheeks to the tips of his ears, and he stared at me with a mixture of horror and confusion. Shit. Why the hell are you crying? He blurted out, his tone defensive. He mumbled something under his breath about me trying to seduce him, but I barely caught it. I was about to explain that I'd simply been hit in the nose, but before I could get a word in, he scrambled up onto his bed like he was avoiding a contagious disease, dove under the covers, and pulled the blanket over his head. I just sat there, dumbfounded. This guy really was something else. Thanks to David Maye, I became a campus legend. Not because of my grades, looks, or family background, but because I, of all people, had managed to get a concussion from his elbow. At first, I thought my social life had died right there in the cafeteria. But soon, I realized that my entire college career had been irrevocably altered. Now, whenever I walked around campus with David, people, whether male or female, would point at me and chant, "That's him. That's the P princess. One touch and he goes down with a concussion." I stiffened up, walking mechanically beside David, wishing I could disappear into the ground. David slapped a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his large palm heavy on my back. "Don't worry about it, man. Everyone gets a nickname in college. 4 years will fly by." I shot him a deadpan look. This was far from comforting. If I had a choice, I wouldn't mind any other nickname. But who on earth wants to be called P Princess, especially when they're a 178 centimeters tall guy? Military training started soon after. While everyone else stood in neat rows in their camouflage uniforms, I sat under a tree, excused from training thanks to my concussion. September was still quite warm, so I lounged there in the shade, completely bored. David had dropped me off at training before heading off to his own session. He was a sophomore, which technically meant we shouldn't have even been in the same dorm. But I'd arrived late on move-in day, and all the spots in my department's dorm were taken, so they stuck me in with David's group. Our other 2 roommates were a finance major who was rarely around and another athlete who had already been sent off for training when David returned. After spending the morning watching everyone else drill, the coach finally called for a break, and a swarm of girls immediately surrounded me. My face flushed. This was the first time in my life I'd been this close to so many girls. And then, I immediately regretted opening my mouth. "P Princess, you live with David Maye, right? Could you add us as friends? Maybe introduce us?" "Yeah, introduce us too. David Maye is so hot. Does he have a girlfriend?" They bombarded me with questions and my head spun. I was about to faint from all the attention when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw David frowning as he noticed the crowd. He called out my name, "Josh Jack." Relieved to hear his voice, I immediately ran toward him like a lost puppy finding its owner. "Did you come to save me?" David didn't answer directly. He glanced over at the girls, smirking. "You're pretty popular, huh?" I gave him a miserable look. How could I be popular when I'd basically lost my ability to date? "They're not here for me. They just want to talk to you. Maybe you should go back there?" David shrugged nonchalantly and started heading toward the 3rd cafeteria. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was in a good mood. "Come on, Prince. If we wait too long, the beef ribs will be gone." At the mention of beef ribs, my stomach growled, and I hurried to keep up with him. Who cared about dating when there were ribs on the line? When we arrived at the cafeteria, the line for the beef ribs was as long as ever. I stood behind David, but just as I settled in, he suddenly grabbed me by the collar and moved me in front of him. What was that for?" I asked, confused. David smirked, shrugging his shoulders. "I don't want to accidentally knock you out again and send you back to the hospital." Nearby students overheard his comment and burst out laughing, their eyes fixed on my reddening face. I quickly turned away, too embarrassed to respond. Then the most awkward thing happened. There was only enough beef ribs left for one more serving. The cafeteria lady, recognizing me, beamed and piled the remaining ribs onto my tray. "Oh, it's you. The one who got the concussion, right? Come back next time, and I'll give you even more." Blushing furiously, I accepted the tray under the weight of David's glaring gaze. With my tray piled high, I carefully made my way to the tables, walking slowly to avoid dizziness or losing my precious ribs. David quickly grabbed a table and took my tray from me, setting it down. "What are you waiting for? Come eat." But throughout the meal, David's eyes kept drifting to my tray, his gaze practically boring holes into my ribs. Feeling guilty, I nudged the tray toward him. "I can't eat all this. Want to share?" David looked at the ribs, then at me, biting his lip before he awkwardly scratched the back of his head. Maybe the cafeteria was too hot because his ears had turned bright red. Muttering to himself, he said, "How could someone so cute not be a girl?" I raised an eyebrow. Up. "Make sure no one bumps into you again and gives you another concussion." He quickly deflected, shoving the tray back to me and even adding a fried chicken leg for good measure. I stared at the chicken leg in disbelief. It was just an accident. No one gets concussions every day. David Maye, for all his brawn, seemed to have the brains of a child. He called me P Princess, and somehow, that meant treating me like one. He'd wake up early to get me breakfast, walk me to the field, and even borrow a small stool from the dorm manager so I could sit comfortably under the trees. After training, he wouldn't even bother showering before rushing over to pick me up for lunch. I'd assumed this was just typical roommate behavior, but things were starting to get out of hand. David Maye even put my shoes on for me, handed me my jacket, and insisted on carrying an umbrella for me whenever I left the dorm. One time, I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. I climbed down the ladder from my bunk, only to hear David's voice in the dark. "Where do you think you're going in the middle of the night?" I jumped. The bathroom?" David grunted, grabbed his phone for light, and followed me out of bed. "Let's go." Too tired to argue, I nodded and headed to the bathroom with David trailing behind me like a bodyguard. He'd had an intense training session that day, and it showed in his sluggish movements. As I stood in front of the toilet, I glanced over at David, who was leaning against the doorframe with no intention of leaving. "David Maye?" I hesitated. "Yeah. I need to use the bathroom." "Yeah. You're blocking the door." He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off his sleepiness, and finally moved out of the way to close the door. When I came out, he was slumped against the wall, fast asleep. Awake, David always had that mischievous grin and sharp features that made him seem untouchable. But asleep, he actually looked kind of peaceful. I was lost in thought when suddenly, David's eyes snapped open, locking onto mine. Caught staring, I blushed. "Enjoying the view?" he teased, his voice still thick with sleep, adding a huskiness to his usual tone. The dim bathroom light made the atmosphere feel strangely intimate. My face inexplicably grew warmer. "I'm done. You can go now," I stammered, turning away. David nodded and stretched, yawning as he walked back to his bed. "Nah, I'm good." "You're not going to the bathroom?" "Nope." "Then why did you get up?" "To keep you company, of course." "You were so scared your voice was shaking." I stared at him, speechless. Was it possible that the reason my voice was shaking was because he had startled me by talking out of nowhere? A few days later, David accompanied me to the hospital for a checkup. The doctor assured us I was fine, and David looked more relieved than I did. David had been so attentive during my recovery that I felt like I owed him. That evening, I dragged him to a restaurant outside of campus. "Let me treat you to dinner." "Thanks for taking care of me all this time." David smirked, his eyes glinting mischievously as he bit his cheek. "So, you really like me, huh?" I rolled my eyes, ignoring his usual flirtatious banter. Used to his antics by now, I simply let it slide. But David wasn't satisfied with my indifference. He pulled out his phone and opened the campus forum. After a few minutes of scrolling, he suddenly shoved his phone in my face, looking unusually serious. "Do you know this person?" Confused, I followed his gaze to the phone screen. There, on the confession wall, was a post. "P Princess's eyelashes are so long." I saw him under the tree the other day, looking so adorably lost. "Do you think he'd like a prince?" "Prince?" I blinked, taken aback. Was a guy confessing to me? I turned to David, still processing what I had just read, and saw that his expression had turned stormy. His eyes were practically burning holes into the screen, like he was ready to track down the poster and beat them senseless. "Are you mad?" I asked cautiously. "Mad? That guy confessed to you," David growled, his fists clenched. I was a bit puzzled by David Maye's behavior, but before I could say anything, the waiter arrived with the hot pot, and the subject was dropped. The conversation remained unfinished, but the tension lingered. Even after we finished eating and headed back to the dorm, David was still brooding, his face set in a grim expression. He had barely spoken a word since dinner. "David, you look upset," I finally remarked. He lifted his gaze, his eyes dark and stormy as they settled on me. Then, with a low growl, he licked his lips and spat out, Stay away from those perverts who like men. His words were harsh and filled with unmistakable disgust. I was taken aback, blinking in confusion. Slowly, I nodded, trying to process what he had just said. My chest felt tight, weighed down by the realization. So, David Maye was straight. I liked men. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my alarm. Groggy, I climbed down from the ladder, ready to start the day. I was just about to slip into my slippers when David walked in, holding breakfast. His eyes landed on my bare feet, and his brows immediately furrowed. Without a word, and right in front of our other roommate, he wrapped an arm around my waist and lifted me off the floor, placing me down gently on a nearby chair. Jesus, David, that arm's strength is insane, our roommate remarked, watching the scene unfold. David shrugged, unfazed, and replied, "Going out early?" "Yeah, morning practice." "See you, David." "You too, Josh." "See you," David responded before turning his attention back to me. He reached over to my bed, grabbed a pair of socks, and knelt down to put them on me. His warm hands clasped around my ankle, and I instinctively jerked back, but he held on tighter. "Stop squirming. You'll catch a cold without socks," he muttered, his tone casual as he focused on his task. My heart raced and my face felt like it was on fire. But as I stared at him, the image of his disgusted expression from the night before resurfaced in my mind. I couldn't shake it. I reached out and stopped him from putting on the second sock. "David, He looked up at me, confused, his eyes meeting mine. The words I had prepared were stuck in my throat. I forced myself to speak, my voice coming out haltingly. "My concussion is better now. You don't have to keep doing this because you feel guilty." David froze, then stood up abruptly, towering over me. His brows knitted together in a fierce scowl. "You think I'm taking care of you because I feel guilty about giving you a concussion?" I couldn't hold his gaze. It felt like his eyes were piercing through me, forcing me to look away. But he grabbed my chin, tilting my head up so I had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Push. Speak." I swallowed hard, my voice shaking as I mumbled, "Or maybe you're just a good person." David's expression darkened even further, like he was barely restraining himself from punching something. He leaned down, bringing his face dangerously close to mine, and said through gritted teeth, "I'm no good person." "Then why?" I stammered, gathering my courage. "Why are you taking care of me? We've only known each other for a little over a week." David looked startled by my question. For a brief moment, his anger wavered, and then he blurted out, "I'm taking care of you because you're the pea princess. You're so weak, if I don't look after you, you'll..." That was it. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears I had been fighting off spilled over. "David, I don't want to be treated like I'm weak. I'm a guy too." His grip on my chin loosened, and he stepped back, suddenly unsure of himself. His hand hovered in the air, like he wanted to wipe away my tears but couldn't bring himself to do it. After a few awkward moments, he sighed and walked to the door, grabbing his bag and jacket. He hesitated for a second before turning back to me. "I bought your favorite buns from the third cafeteria. Make sure to eat them while they're still warm." I watched him leave, tears dropping onto my lap. After a while, I bent down, picked up the socks he had left on the floor, and put them on myself. When I glanced back at the table, the buns were still there, untouched. For the next week, David continued to bring me breakfast, but I never accepted it. I avoided him, hiding behind the curtains of my bed whenever he was around, refusing to engage. I couldn't let myself fall for him. On Wednesday, I walked into the lecture hall and immediately noticed that something felt off. Everyone was staring at me with strange looks. The class was popular, and the front seats were already taken. The back was almost full too, except for one spot in the middle. A bright-eyed guy was waving me over enthusiastically. "Hey, over here. There's a seat," he called out, smiling brightly. People in the room snickered, watching me as if they were waiting for something. Hesitant, I walked over. There was a black jacket draped over the seat, and I paused for a moment, unsure. The guy quickly grabbed the jacket and pulled it onto himself. "Oh, sorry. I was saving it for a friend, but he texted me that he's sick and can't make it." He was full of energy, explaining quickly and flashing a wide grin. His cheerfulness was almost odd, considering his friend was sick, but I thanked him anyway. Thanks. He blushed and waved his hands dismissively. No problem. By the way, I'm Ziv Kim. Nice to meet you. I'm Josh. We sat through 2 lectures, and by lunchtime, Ziv and I had exchanged WeChat contacts and made plans to grab lunch together. As we walked, Ziv suggested the second cafeteria. Let's go there today. They've got braised beef, just as good as the ribs you like at the third cafeteria. His playful attitude made me laugh. Alright, you've convinced me. Let's give it a try. We were halfway through our meal when a message from an older classmate popped up on my phone. She had sent me a screenshot of a confession from the school's wall. The Pea Princess is so adorable. Today, the prince finally rescued him from the dragon. Beneath the post was a picture of me smiling back at Ziv as we lined up for food. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to think. I looked up at Ziv, about to ask him if he had seen the post, but he was already holding his phone up with the confession page open, smirking mischievously. My face turned red. I had known I liked guys since adolescence, but this was the first time another guy had openly shown interest in me. Before I could process it further, I noticed a figure storming toward us from the cafeteria entrance. It was David, dressed in his sports gear, his face twisted in anger. His eyes locked onto me, then shifted to Ziv. Without warning, David marched up to Ziv and grabbed him by the collar. Didn't I tell you to stay away from him? David's voice was filled with fury. I thought he was talking about me and started to explain, but Ziv was quicker with his comeback, his tone dripping with sarcasm. What? You really think you're the dragon now? Who Josh hangs out with isn't up to you? David didn't answer. Instead, he let out a cold laugh, his tongue pressing against his cheek in frustration. Josh doesn't like you. And how do you know that? Ziv shot back. Because he doesn't like guys. David snarled, pulling Ziv from his seat with a murderous look in his eyes. Ziv wasn't exactly small, but compared to David's towering frame, he was powerless. David was ready to throw him across the cafeteria, and I quickly grabbed his arm, trying to pull them apart. David, let go. Don't hurt him, I pleaded, my voice rising in panic. A few other students nearby stepped in to help, but David wouldn't budge. He held onto Ziv with an iron grip, his jaw clenched tight. David Maye, I shouted, my voice sharp with frustration. He finally turned to look at me, his expression shifting from anger to something more vulnerable. I told you to stay away from these perverts who like men. David's voice was strained, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't listening to him. My heart ached. I took a deep breath and faced him, my words steady and firm. David, I'm one of those perverts who likes men too. So if you're afraid I'll fall for you, then you should stay away from me as well. David's eyes widened in shock, his grip on Ziv loosening as the realization sank in. He stared at me, completely speechless, as if the ground had just disappeared beneath him. I watched his expression crumble, the pain in my chest intensifying. I started to reach for Ziv, but before I could, David grabbed my wrist and dragged me out of the cafeteria. David Maye, I called after him, but he didn't stop until we were deep in the woods beside the second cafeteria. There, he finally let go, standing silently, his eyes clouded with emotions I couldn't quite read. I've already said everything I needed to say, I told him quietly, turning to leave. But David caught my wrist again, pulling me back. Frustrated, I turned to ask what he wanted from me, but when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that made my heart clench. He looked like a lost puppy caught in the rain, drenched and desperate. So, you've been avoiding me all week because of what I said? That liking men makes you a freak. His voice trembled, and his eyes shimmered with something close to regret. I bit my lip, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall again. You're homophobic, David. I like men. You can't accept that, so it's better if we just keep our distance? I paused, gathering the strength to continue. And for the record, David, I'm not a freak. Liking someone means liking them for who they are, their face, their personality, how they treat you. It's not about liking just any guy. David's grip tightened on my wrist, and what he said next left me stunned. So, you like Ziv Kim? His voice cracked as he spoke, his eyes turning red as he jumped to the conclusion. I stared at him, torn between the urge to cry and the urge to laugh at his sheer stupidity. David, are you an idiot? How did you even get into a university? With your pig-headed brain? He blinked at me, then inched closer, his voice pitiful as he muttered, I'm an athlete. Get lost. In the days that followed, I wanted nothing to do with David Maya. I feared if this continued, I might meet an early demise. David, however, seemed to have other plans. He followed me everywhere like a guard dog watching over his precious charge, keeping me under constant surveillance. Any time I wasn't in his line of sight for more than 2 minutes, excluding his training sessions, my phone would blow up with his calls. Josh, where are you? I can't find you. Josh, are you with Ziv Kim? Josh, answer me. If you don't reply, I'll ask Ziv Kim myself. Exasperated, I pulled up my pants, pushed open the bathroom stall, and hastily washed my hands. As I stepped out, I saw David storming toward the door with murder in his eyes. I rushed to grab him by the arm. Where are you going? The moment he saw me, his expression shifted as if someone had flipped a switch. The anger melted away, replaced by a pitiful look of relief. I couldn't find you. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. David, listen. I like men. Ziv likes men too. If we end up together, that's completely normal. No. David interrupted me immediately, his lips pressed into a stubborn line. His sudden outburst made the air around us heavy with tension. Why not? I asked directly, a strange sense of hopefulness bubbling inside me. But David just stood there, biting his lip in silence for what felt like an eternity. Just, no, he finally blurted, clearly frustrated. I let out a long breath, unable to hide the disappointment in my eyes. David, you're a good person, and I want to be your friend. But I like men. Even if it's not Ziv Kim now, someday it will be Ziv Brown or Ziv Green or someone else. I can't give up on having a boyfriend just because we're friends. Why not? I can do it. David shouted, his brows knitting together in frustration. What about marriage? I asked, looking down at the ground to avoid his gaze. What if you meet a girl you like someday? David stepped closer, his voice quieter but filled with determination. Josh, if you don't want to be with guys, I won't be with girls. We can be together, can't we? I smiled bitterly and looked up at him. And what would we be? Friends? Brothers? Or something else? Why not brothers? David asked, his eyes full of hope. I shook my head slowly. Brothers can't be together forever. I turned away, ending the conversation, and David followed me, his face clouded with confusion and frustration. As we walked through campus, the tension was so thick that even the students passing by gave us a wide berth, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. Later, we ran into Ziv Kim during class. He waved at me enthusiastically as if nothing had happened the last time we saw each other. David, who had walked me to class, narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, but I quickly grabbed his arm to stop him. You should head to training, I told him. David stared at me for a long moment, muttered a curse under his breath, and stormed off in a huff. After class, Ziv invited me to lunch at the second cafeteria. But as soon as we stepped outside, there was David, standing by the entrance with his arms crossed, looking like someone owed him money. Ziv glanced at me, a sly smile creeping across his face. He leaned in close and whispered, "The dragon looks really pissed. Wanna know if he likes you?" His words took me by surprise, and before I could react, Ziv suddenly leaned in as if to kiss me. I flinched, but he managed to plant a light kiss on my cheek before I could pull away. David saw everything. His face darkened with fury as he lunged forward, landing a punch squarely on Ziv's face and knocking him to the ground. I immediately rushed forward and wrapped my arms around David's waist, trying to pull him back. "David!" I yelled. David glared down at Ziv, who was lying on the ground but grinning despite the punch. "Didn't I tell you to stay the hell away from Josh?" Ziv, unfazed, looked up at David and said mockingly, "Have you ever thought about why you're so possessive of Josh? You keep saying he should stay away from guys who like men. But what about you? Are you any different?" David froze, his body rigid as he stared down at Ziv, his eyes filled with murderous intent. "I don't like men." Ziv laughed, taunting him further. "Really? Then can you honestly say you don't like Josh Jack?" Josh is a guy too. I like him and desire him. What about you? Don't you? David's grip on my arm tightened, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Then, with a cold chuckle, he pressed his tongue against his cheek and said, whether Josh likes men or women, it doesn't matter. The only person he's allowed to like is me. With that, he grabbed me by the arm and dragged me away, leaving Ziv sitting alone on the ground. As I looked back at him, his expression had turned melancholic. Later that afternoon, the confession wall on campus read, "The princess was taken by the dragon, and the prince didn't stop him. Because the princess likes the dragon." In our empty dorm room, David sat in silence, while I stood near the door, my mind racing with questions. What had he meant earlier? Did he really like me? Or was he just trying to one-up Ziv in that moment of anger? Eventually, David looked up and walked over to me, his tall frame casting a shadow over me. "Josh," he said softly, taking my hand and placing it over his chest. "Can you feel that? It hurts." His heartbeat was racing beneath my palm, and as I tried to pull my hand away, he held it there, his grip tightening. "Josh, if you like guys, then like me. I've been doing some research, and it turns out athletic guys are the most popular among men who like men. I'm good-looking, come from a decent family, and I've got stamina to boot." Wait, what? My brain felt like it had turned to mush. Since when did this conversation become about stamina? But before I could process his words, David continued, "I'm definitely better than that weakling Ziv Kim. Just look at him." I tried to push him away, but David leaned down and kissed me, silencing me completely. When he pulled back, he grinned, a smug, playful look on his face. "You taste so sweet. Let's do it again, Josh." He pressed me against the door and kissed me over and over until my neck finally gave out with a crack. I winced in pain, and David's eyes went wide with horror as he quickly scooped me up into his arms in a bridal carry and rushed me to the hospital. Naturally, this became yet another legendary moment on the campus forums. There was a big scene in the lecture hall today. I was there. Ziv Kim kissed P-Princess Josh Jack, and our David daddy punched him to the ground. Wait, who got punched? Josh Jack? No way. David daddy treats Josh like royalty. It had to be the third wheel that got hit. So does David daddy like Josh? Bro, you've been living under a rock. David daddy's whole department knows he's head over heels for Josh Jack. He's the only one who doesn't realize it. +1. Last time Josh and David had a fight, David almost killed us all during training. Hey, guys, just saw David daddy carrying Josh in a bridal hold to the hospital. Guess what? Less than an hour after that fight. Wait, what? Only an hour? With David daddy's stamina? Maybe. David's too impressive, and Josh got hurt again. Scary. Scary +1. Scary +1. By the time I returned to campus, wearing a white neck brace, students were already staring at me with a mix of awe and amusement. On top of my previous reputation as the P-Princess who got a concussion from an elbow, I now had a new legend. The guy who hurt his neck while kissing. David walked beside me, carefully watching my every move, and I thought maybe he had finally learned his lesson. That is, until I checked the campus forum again. David Maye, guess what? I'm no longer single. Wife with teary eyes wearing a neck brace.jpg. Wife glaring.jpg. Wife angrily biting into an apple.jpg. Wife blushing after a shower.jpg. And just like that, the last picture was deleted. What happened? Why'd David delete the last one? I didn't get to see it. David replied, "You brats, I didn't even get a good look at it. Want to see? Get your own girlfriend." Oh, David daddy is acting like a mother hen. I pulled back the curtain of my bed and glared at David. He immediately sat up, eyes sparkling with excitement. "Wife, what's wrong? Want some water? Need something? Stop calling me your wife. I never agreed to anything. You're spreading rumors on the forum." David grinned mischievously, licking his lips like the rascal I had come to know all too well. "We've already kissed. Don't want to take responsibility?" My face turned beet red as our other roommate threw off his blanket with an exaggerated sigh and pulled back his curtain. "Guys, come on. There's still a third person in this room. Can you two maybe treat me like I exist?" I quickly pulled the curtain closed, hiding my burning face as David's laughter echoed in the room. On Christmas Day, David practically dragged me out for what he called a date. The destination? A hot springs resort in the outskirts of town. I had just finished changing when I spotted David lounging in the steaming water, wearing nothing but a towel and holding his phone. Hearing me approach, he glanced up, his eyes lighting up as he got out of the water and walked toward me. He extended his hand with a playful grin. "Your Highness, take my hand so you don't trip." His tone was straight out of a drama, and I shot him a glare as I took his hand. But the last step down was slippery, and David pulled me into his arms. I stumbled, my face landing squarely against his chest, and before I knew it, my legs were wrapped around his waist, making us the same height. "This way, I can kiss you without hurting your neck," he said with a dead serious expression before pressing his lips to mine. The water rippled around us as we kissed, the night sky stretching endlessly above, the stars twinkling faintly behind a veil of clouds. Time blurred into the soft whispers of night, until all that was left were fleeting words, lost in the mist as it scattered beneath the stars. The end.
Thanks for stopping by. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos.